So I just did the video about the economy. And I wanted to take a break. And I found three tempting videos. Two of which are from this man right here. And I was just really curious about where he stands on Christianity as a whole. And this video is literally titled Why I'm Not a Christian. And so I'm curious as to why he is not a Christian. And the title is Christianity's Fatal Error. So I'm very curious. I also have this one, which, ooh, why quite a title. But I felt Ken Ham is probably gonna say something incredibly ignorant. And I kind of was curious as to how he was going to just completely fuck everything up. So I'm gonna do this one first, because I don't want to get too angry too early. So let's go.
If you were to ask me to give you just one reason why I'm an atheist, I could probably condense it down to a lack of sufficient evidence for the existence of a god or gods. But if you were to ask me why I'm not a Christian, it would be a lot harder for me to give you just one answer, because the Bible and most Christian interpretations come packed with a plethora of fatal problems. Any one of them is enough to bring the entire house of cards crashing down, but one of them stands above the rest as the most damning catastrophe for the Christian faith. And you don't need a PhD in history or extensive knowledge about science, religion, or philosophy to see why. And no, it's not the problem of evil or suffering.
Okay, so, I wanted to, because I know I've said many times that I am not an atheist anymore, and he said that there's no sufficient evidence that he's found of a god or gods. I want to inform everyone that I actually agree with that point. The reason why I do not force my personal religion on anyone else is because I know there's no solid evidence for it. I know that I'm never going to be able to convince most people. I understand that. I also, coincidentally, the religion I believe in doesn't say that people will go to fucking hell if they don't believe in it. In my eyes, Freya doesn't care if you believe in her. Freya just cares if you're a warrior or not, if you have the spirit of a warrior. That's my personal stance on it.
This is the problem of instruction, Christianity's fatal error.
Fucking love that intro. That's great. fucking Halo.
The God of the Christian faith is often referred to as an omni-God because he's believed by most Christians to be omnipotent or all-powerful, omniscient or all-knowing, omnibenevolent or all-loving, and omnipresent. He's basically everywhere at once. Some apologists prefer the term maximally great.
God can be defined as a maximally great being. And in order to be maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible way.
Which is a flaw in and of itself, because there's no such thing as a morally perfect being. Even me, even myself, I consider myself to be better than like 90% of people when it comes to moral objectivity. And now that's not the same thing as objective morals, but moral objectivity is when you can consider all of the facts involved and figure out who is in the wrong based on as little subjective thinking as possible. And I feel that I am very good when it comes to that. But even I am not morally perfect, because there's no such thing as morally perfect. One person's moral good can be another person's moral bad because it's subjective.
Assume that this kind of God exists, then you're left with a major problem. The problem of instruction. To understand this conundrum, we first need to start with a hypothetical, a thought experiment. Forget everything that you know about the Bible for just a moment and pretend that you're in a hypothetical alternative universe with a different omnigod. If this deity is all-loving, all-knowing, omnipresent, and all-powerful, and is trying to communicate the most important message in the universe to his or her children, how would they communicate this vital message? And conversely, if this God either didn't exist at all or turned out to be limited in knowledge, love, power, or locality, what would you expect to see instead? In the first scenario with the omnigod, you would expect perfect communication. Any decent newspaper editor knows that the average person reads at or below the 8th grade level, and they tailor their paper accordingly, so as to be widely accessible and easily understood. They avoid technical jargon and ambiguous words as much as they possibly can, and they provide clarification and define and explain what they mean when they need to. We should expect that an all-knowing God of the universe who created the brains of their target audience would know this, would know our cognitive and linguistic shortcomings, and would craft this critical message with similar precision. Now, there's a number of
I would actually say that they wouldn't make it a book in the first place. They would just embed it into their creation's brain. They wouldn't go out of their way to make a super vague, easily misunderstood book that all of their followers have a different idea on what everything means in it. They would just embed morality into their brains. Which, if there were such a thing as objective morality, we would inherently know it. But if you actually take a look at it, many people disagree on what is morally correct. And honestly, Christians try to make a point. Many Christians try to go, oh, well, you know inherently not to kill, which, no, you don't. You have to be taught that. You have to be taught that murder is wrong. And even then, some people never actually agree that murder is wrong. That's why there are so many serial killers that exist in the world. You think they think murder is wrong? They don't care. They don't think murder is wrong. They just think it's something they like to do.
Viable ways that this message could be perfectly transmitted. At first I thought maybe God could place enormous, divinely protected plaques all over the world with very literal, extremely clear instructions on them. These plaques would be indestructible and tamper-proof, since what good is a divinely inspired message without divine preservation? As society and language change, the messages could
It's the rats. I love that. That's funny. Don't listen to the colonists. That's fucking great. That's awesome.
to ensure maximal clarity, keep up with current events, and meet the needs and answer the questions of
Tide Pods! Oh my god, these billboards are great. These billboards are fucking hilarious.
Of God's children, sort of like God's message board. Or he could write a message for all of us to see in the sky, or even on the moon. But then I thought, not everyone's
dick. Don't be a dick written on the moon.
literate, or speaks the same language. Some people are blind, etc. But remember, no challenge is too big for an all-powerful God, and an all-loving God would care enough to overcome this challenge. If God is everywhere at once, he could just tell us his message in person and coach us directly. But some people might argue that his presence would overwhelm us, and while I think that's kind of a cop-out, I do acknowledge the objection. So
it very much so is a cop-out, but for the sake of the argument, let's use things that we agree on to debunk the argument.
What if instead each person receives God's message in their own language, hand-tailored for them, such that it's perfectly communicated in a way that everyone would understand and reach the same conclusion? A message preloaded into everyone's brains, meant to...
I fucking love it when I say something and then they just say it after me.
Firmware that we're all born with. It would come straight from God, not through human authors. It would be directed to all mankind from the get-go, not just to a tiny handful of self-proclaimed chosen people. And there would be no internal inconsistencies in the message, no historical contradictions or scientific inaccuracies, and unlike with a conscience, what we deem as right and wrong wouldn't change from culture to culture, and you wouldn't have
Man, he's just speed running everything I just said earlier.
Psychopaths who lack one altogether. This would be a ubiquitous, accessible, clear, and perfect message. Because the communication of a perfect God should be perfect. But what if the alternative was true? What if there's no God at all, or the God/gods who do exist aren't omni-gods like the God of the Bible? Well, we'd expect to see a very, very different result. We would expect to find wildly different religions popping up all over the world, written by scientifically ignorant ancient authors desperately trying to make sense of their tiny, myopic view of the universe around.
Which is why I say that if the Christian God exists, he is just a raging narcissist. Because there's no way that the Christian God is perfect if he exists, because he wouldn't have done things in the way that he did, or the way that is described in the Bible, if that were the case.
You wouldn't expect to find any supernatural insights about germs, neurochemistry, and mental health, heliocentrism, DNA, any knowledge of other galaxies, or any information not already available to their primitive cultures. At best, you might occasionally just get a few lucky guesses here and there. Many, if not most, of these holy books would place humanity at the center and contain stories about human experiences, of violent warlords, superstitions, wild legends, human heroes, and of unseen monsters lurking in the dark. Morality would vary from culture to culture, with some even...
I'm not sure if I can show I thought about it for a second, and I'm honestly not sure if I can... I mean, there was no 18 and up warning on this video, but for those of you who saw it, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to mention it because I don't want this video taken down, and I don't want to strike on my channel. But I am really surprised that that actually got through YouTube's checking.
Sacrificing animals or even fellow humans to the gods. But strangely, no gods would step in to correct these gross misconceptions about their bloodlusts.
Exactly.
Or mentor humanity on right and wrong.
Is he asleep? No. I'm pretty sure he's dead.
Instead, cultures would have to progress morally on their own, because these holy books would be chained to the morality of their time, justifying barbaric practices like slavery, witch burning, because yes, they would still believe in witches, homophobia, sexism, genocide, etc. Of the many religions springing up everywhere, some would fizzle out, while others might be more relatable and would spread more rapidly. They may contain more contagious ideas with stronger sticking power. If you haven't realized already, Christianity is described perfectly by the latter scenario.
Was thinking that the whole time. Just waiting for him to say it.
Direct conflict with its insistence on the existence of an omnigod, a claim on which the truth of the Bible is entirely contingent. But it gets even worse for Christianity. For those who don't know the history of the Bible, it was concocted millennia before the printing press, video cameras, or the internet, in a small, rural, mostly illiterate backwater by otherwise insignificant goat herders searching for spiritual significance. Its contents were compiled and molded over time like a patchwork of stories, with centuries between the events described and when they were actually written down, a multi-generational game of telephone, and centuries more passed before they were finally copied.
I didn't even know that it was like a bunch of puzzle pieces that they put together. I didn't even know that.
Onto our oldest surviving manuscript.
It's actually really funny because in one of my more recent videos, I forget who it was, but one of the Christians I was responding to, they were talking about how, oh yeah, we confer with the originals. Are you sure about that? Because the originals are definitely lost to time by now.
Manuscripts. None of our original documents have been divinely preserved. For example, the story of the Exodus, if it did occur, would have happened sometime between the 15th and 13th century BCE. But most scholars don't think it was actually compiled into its current written form until centuries later, sometime between the late 6th and 4th centuries BCE. And our oldest surviving, albeit fragmentary, manuscript of the Exodus dates to no earlier than 250 BCE.
See, guys? See?
About 1,000 years after the events described. And it's even worse for the older stories in the Bible contained in, say, the book of Genesis, like Sodom and Gomorrah, or the flood and creation myths. And even the various later manuscripts that have survived are riddled with copying errors, mistakes, and changes between them. Passages have been added and removed. For example, Matthew 8.
Which is why Answers in Genesis' stance of every version of the Bible is true and accurate to reality is just batshit fucking insane.
18 jumps straight from verse 10 to verse 12. That's weird. And just one chapter earlier, Matthew 17 skips from verse 20 to verse 22. These missing verses weren't in our earliest manuscripts, but were added later and were considered part of the Bible for centuries before we discovered these older manuscripts and edited these verses back out. The same is true for the ending of the Lord's Prayer, although some translations, like the King James Version, still leave this later addition in, while others don't. By contrast, Matthew 12:47 also isn't in our earliest New Testament manuscripts and was added later, but unlike with these other examples, this one was never removed. The same is true for the story of the woman caught in adultery. These are just a few of the many known examples of how the Bible has changed over time, and we'll never know the exact number of edits that have occurred since we don't and probably never will have any of the original texts. The Bible is riddled with scientific inaccuracies, internal contradictions, and mistakes where it deviates from the historical record. I've done in-depth videos on all of these things, and that's not to mention the addition of all of the horrifically immoral sanctions contained in its pages. Sure, it's easy for apologists to say that these are all misinterpretations of God's intended message, but doesn't that speak to God's failure as a communicator? Does God not understand the minds of his creation or the importance of clarity, or is he not capable of clear communication? Unless he doesn't exist, isn't present, or doesn't care. No matter how you look at it, this is strong evidence against the God of the Bible. But imagine for a moment that the Bible...
Yep. There are many, many different points to talk about when it comes to how Christians adamantly say that the God of the Bible is perfect in every way, while many of the things that he does many of the things that they say that he does just kind of prove that he isn't all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and all-present.
is true, but all of the verses on, say, slavery in the Bible aren't meant to be taken literally. After all, a benevolent God would never condone something so utterly atrocious. But it's written literally, it's taken literally, and for thousands of years, God sits back and watches, arms folded, as millions of people are enslaved, with his words used as the primary justification for it. And he offers not so much as an amendment or a clarifier.
And nowadays, Christians like to act like the Bible doesn't condone it, even though it literally says the right way to do it. Why would you say, why would you explain how you should do something if you don't condone it in the first place?
In this time, it would take centuries of Old Testament laws before this perfect, inerrant message would finally get an update, a New Testament. But even with the New Testament, after 1,000 years of beta testing his laws, when God could have patched the system with some type of a clarifier about not owning another human being, we would instead get slaves obey your masters, leading to centuries more of religiously sanctioned atrocities. And even if none of that was the case, and this message was completely perfect and had been communicated perfectly, much of the world still doesn't have access to it. Human translators have painstakingly tried to translate the Bible into every language on Earth, and after thousands of years, their job's still not done. And all the while, linguistic metaphors and figures...
Oh, for the record, my cat is fine. He has food. He has water. All he wants right now is attention.
Of speech have inevitably been lost in the process, unintentionally changing the meaning of the text, which is why in English alone there are dozens of different versions of God's inerrant message. A message so nebulous that countless interpretations have emerged from those versions, splintering Christianity into tens of thousands of denominations, with entire wars being fought over who's reading it correctly. With all the clarity and precision of a Jackson Pollock painting, core doctrine...
I love that. All the clarity of a Jackson Pollock painting. That was great. I love that. Oh man, this guy, he he has a way with words.
Had to be voted on by people interpreting a loose collection of translations of copies of copies of copies, which happened hundreds of years after the stories allegedly took place. And even after all the books in the Bible were finally finished, for centuries there would be no consensus on which of these books were even canonical and should be included in the Bible, and which shouldn't. And even today, there's still some disagreement over this. Theologians, pastors, and apologists have dedicated decades of their lives to desperately attempting to somehow salvage this wreck, crafting books, sermons, and lectures filled with mental gymnastics and riddled with logical fallacies. Although...
Riddled with logical fallacies is being generous. Sometimes I think that pretty much everything they say is just part of one fallacy or another. Because, good Lord, you'd be surprised just how much that Christians say is just a logical fallacy.
One thing that most of them agree on is that we don't actually know who wrote most of the books of the Bible. They're anonymous! Now you might be wondering, with a communication problem this massive, how has this disaster spread so far and wide? Well, one way is through emotional trauma and fear, instilling in people the fear of eternal damnation, teaching them that they have a problem before attempting to sell them the cure. It's also been spread at the tip of the sword, forced upon the conquered, on natives and slaves. Generation after generation has indoctrinated their children, teaching them to...
Which is why I am so angry with Answers in Genesis. Because they go on and on about how, scientists are indoctrinating children when they have children in their lectures, in their sermons. It's a blatant double standard that is very clearly more of a problem on their end than it is on the end of educators.
to believe baseless assertions on faith, teaching them that faith is a virtue. Entire countries have adopted Christianity as part of their culture, making it a part of a collective identity, fearing that the alternative was divine wrath here on earth in addition to the eternal torturous hellfire of the hereafter. Fear is an extremely powerful tool. And as for the skeptics who dared to doubt, well, for centuries, non-believers have been denigrated from pulpits everywhere, shunned, demonized, ostracized, and sometimes even killed.
Many times they have been killed. I mean, there have been countless times where Christians have rode into battle on horses and killed anyone who wouldn't convert. It's disgusting.
For simply being honest enough to point out a few of these glaring problems.
To the atheist watching this telecast, if our belief in God offends you, move.
No. We have just as much a right to be here as you. Why don't you move if you don't like us complaining about it, jackass?
There are planes leaving every hour on the hour, going every place on planet Earth. Get on one. We don't want you, and we won't
The feeling is mutual, motherfucker.
miss you. I promise you.
And the cherry on top of all of this is that the Bible is so long, so convoluted, archaic, and cryptic that most believers have never even read it through cover to cover, because if they did, they would see for themselves exactly what I'm talking about.
Which again is why I've been saying for quite a while now that if you are honestly still a Christian after reading the Bible from cover to cover, you are one of three things. And maybe even two or all three of them. One, a bad person. Two, lying to others. Three, lying to yourself. Lying to yourself and others was one, I should split it up. Okay, one or multiple of four things. A bad person, lying to yourself, lying to others, and or you haven't fully understood the magnitude of what you read.
This idea is new or interesting to you, or you find some value in the videos that I make and the way that I present them, you can support my work with a per video pledge on patreon.com/holykoolaid, a monthly pledge on Subscribestar, or a one-time donation on PayPal. Your support is what allows me to do this full-time, to pay my editor, to cover all my equipment costs, my travel costs, research, and all of the...
Unfortunately, I don't have the money to do that. Yeah, this video seems to be done. I'm gonna end it here.